Sabretooth was like many boom towns on the northern frontier, a collection of rough clapboard buildings springing up overnight along a single main street. It was one of the few places in the northeastern territories of Soolian-occupied Arthuriea where one could get their hands on civilized comforts such as a good glass of whiskey, a hot meal, a bed, and most importantly 4 walls and a roof. These luxuries were highly sought after by the men who worked the nearby mines, lumber mills, and cattle ranches. They usually made do with ratty blankets, leaky lean-tos, and half-spoiled salt pork. The people of Sabretooth were more than happy to welcome these men and relieve them of their hard-earned money. The town offered more than its fair share of saloons. Over half a dozen crowded the narrow stretch of the muddy main street, while a half-dozen more were built in the back alleys and side streets. The most popular saloon on the main street was called the Hang Dog, named after an ugly event in the town's history. A fur trapper had brought his prized wolf dog into the settlement to sell it. Unfortunately, the animal contracted rabies during its stay and had gone on a rampage. The carnage was only stopped when a man lassoed the beast from a window on the second floor of the saloon and strangled the animal to death. The fur trapper was run out of town and was never seen nor heard from again. Since that day, the Hang Dog Saloon had been frequented by rough men of the frontier, miners, hunters, trappers, bounty hunters, gamblers, and gunfighters. The barkeep was a large, brutish man called Big Dole. He was known for his ability to handle even the meanest of drunks and keep the peace, for the most part. He had only been forced to kill 3 men in self-defense during his tenure as owner. He had proven himself handy with either the heavy, knotted oaken club that he always had stuffed into his belt, or his old sawed-off shotgun stashed behind the bar and loaded with buckshot. Big Dole was currently munching on a cigar and cleaning a shot glass. He turned his gaze from the greasy bar to the main room of the saloon. It was a dark, smoky place with a low wooden ceiling, held up by 3 large, rough-hewn logs. There were only 2 windows on this floor, and both faced out onto the muddy street. A fire roared in the stone hearth that was built in the back of the room, but the heat barely made it past the first few tables. It was late in the evening, and a blizzard was howling just outside, dumping several feet of snow in only a few hours. Despite the darkness and the cold outside, the crowd in the saloon was in good spirits. A rowdy song rang through the air as the piano was played, and patrons sang along, pounding their pewter mugs on the wooden tables in rhythm to the music. In one corner, a few of the men had gathered around a table, their attention riveted to a game of poker. They were all well on their way to becoming drunk. A pile of gold and silver coins and crumpled banknotes sat in the center of the table, awaiting the winner. The man who was holding the winning hand was a tall, broad-shouldered, black-bearded fellow called Gus McCoy. He had a long-jawed, homely face and wore a dirty, patched red and black checkered flannel shirt and a battered leather overcoat. His black, broad-rimmed hat was nearly as old as he was, and just as ugly. He was well known around town as a successful scalp hunter. He was considered successful because he had lived long enough to spend his blood money, something that not many other scalp hunters could boast of. He had started his career as a killer during the Great Panic, when the native tribes of the primitive Madoc men, collectively known as Yarkies, had revolted against their colonial overlords. The imperial governor of the eastern colonies had placed a bounty on the scalps of the rebelling tribesmen, and men like Gus McCoy had eagerly answered the call. The Madoc men had been crushed, although not before several colonial settlements had been massacred to the last man, woman, and child. Gus had been around Sabretooth for the last year or so, making the town his personal haunt. What he did for a living now that the war was long over, no one really knew. All they knew for certain was that his money was good, and that was enough for the townspeople. "Well, gentlemen," said Gus, eyeing the men seated around the table, "what'll it be? You call-in or fold-in?" One by one the other players tossed in their cards, conceding defeat. They grumbled and glared at Gus, hating him and his wretched streak of good luck. Nearly all the men got up and made their way to the bar to drink away their sorrows and bruised egos. Only one, a tall, thin man with a hawk-like face and a short, trimmed blonde beard, remained seated. He stared intently at Gus across the table for several long, silent moments. "You're bluffing," he said at last, shaking his head. "I don't buy it. Ain't no way anyone can win 10 hands in a row." "You calling me a cheat?" Gus growled, his eyes narrowing. "Nope, not at all," the tall man replied, leaning back in his chair. "I'm just saying I don't believe your luck can possibly hold out. I think you got nothing in your hand but a fat load of nothing." "Well, why don't we just see about that? I'm ready to put my money where my mouth is. I say I have the best hand, and I'm willing to wager on it. So, how much you willing to lose?" "I'll raise you 50 more, the gambler replied confidently. Gus sneered with a wicked glint in his eye. "All right, I'll match that. In fact, I'll go all in. How about it? You willing to risk your shirt?" "Very well, I'll match you. All in." They both shoved their piles into the center of the table, and then they laid their cards down. "Read 'em and weep," Gus chuckled, revealing his hand. The tall man looked down at them, and his face went pale with horror, a royal flush. "Damn it!" he cried as he gazed down at the cards that had stripped him of his gold. He slumped back in his wicker chair, his shoulders sagging and his hands curling into fists. For a split second, he considered pulling out his gun to either shoot his opponent or to force him to return the money. His hand began to reach for the holstered pistol that hung from his gun belt, but then he thought better of it. He'd already been run out of a dozen other towns before now for losing his temper and getting into gunfights. He had no desire to be run out of this town, backwater though it was. That would mean fleeing through the blizzard that was howling just outside. The gambler glared ruefully at Gus McCoy for several long seconds. Gus stared back at him, his eyes twinkling in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. The gambler hung his head in shame. Several patrons who had been watching the game laughed at his misfortune. "Sorry there, young fella," Gus snorted, laughing as he pulled the pot towards himself. "No hard feelings, eh? It was just pure simple luck, that's all. Lady Luck is really taking a shine to me these days. And just so you see that I ain't a sore winner." He turned in his chair towards the front bar. "Next round of drinks are on me." The patrons all cheered loudly as they rushed to place their orders. Gus leaned back in his chair and laughed loudly, nodding at the barkeep who winked knowingly and began filling glasses with the cheapest whiskey in the place. Very soon, the smoky air of the saloon was filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, raucous laughter, and drunken singing. Gus leaned back and grinned, tipping his glass to Big Dole. He was enjoying himself immensely. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigar and lit it with a match that he'd been chewing. He took a deep puff and exhaled slowly, watching the blue-grey smoke drift up towards the low ceiling. "Ah, yes, life is good," he mused to himself. It was at that moment that the stranger walked in. He was young, perhaps only 21 or 22. He was clad in a heavy buffalo-skin coat that went down past his knees, and underneath this he was dressed all in buckskins. His shirt, pants, and high-top moccasins were crafted from tanned deer hide. His slouch hat was old, worn and pulled low against the flying snow outside. The young man carried himself with a confident air, standing tall and proud. He was missing his left eye, and wore a black leather patch over it, partly covering the long and jagged scar that ran down his brow and cheek. He looked around the room, scanning the crowd, mentally noting the position of every person and their state of sobriety or drunkenness. The saloon patrons didn't pay him much attention and went on with their carousing. The only exception was the barkeep, who eyed the young man with suspicion. "Out kind of late, aren't you, son?" he said gruffly. "You must be half frozen. What'll it be? First drink is on the house for newcomers." The young man looked at him briefly with his one good eye, his face unreadable. Big Dole returned the gaze and found himself shuddering. There was a look in this young man's eye that made him feel as though he were nothing more than a mere mouse gazing up at a leering mountain lion. Big Dole didn't scare easily, but he found himself inexplicably afraid of this newcomer. Perhaps it was the coldness in his one good eye, or it was the scar that marked the full length of his face. Maybe it was the fact that despite being out in a blizzard just moments ago, this young man wasn't shivering at all. He appeared completely unaffected by the bone-chilling cold. Big Dole couldn't stand the young man's gaze anymore. He pretended to cough and turned away as fast as he dared. The stranger remained silent. He turned and strode towards the table where Gus was sitting. He was laughing heartily with a pair of pretty girls who were hanging onto his arms. The young stranger stood across from him, staring at the bearded man with his one good eye. "Something I can do for you, boy?" Gus asked after he noticed him. He looked up into the stranger's lean, clean-shaven face and snorted. "That big bay-colored horse out front, he yours?" the stranger said after a long moment of heavy silence. Gus raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, that's right. He ain't for sale if that's what you're asking. I only just got him last week. Won him in a card game as a matter of fact." "Is he fresh?" "Fresh? Is he fit for a long ride?" Gus once again arched his eyebrow in confusion. The young man continued to stare at him. "Listen, son," the bearded man said. "If you need something, you'd best spit it out and get to it, because I got these two lovely ladies to attend to, and I ain't aiming to disappoint either of 'em." The pair of girls giggled as Gus gave each of them a wicked smile. The young man remained silent, but he gave both girls such a glare that they quickly excused themselves from the scene and moved away. Gus attempted to grab their arms, but they quickly evaded him and retreated to the far end of the bar on the other side of the room. Gus watched them go, his shoulders sagging like a deflated balloon. He turned back to the stranger, his expression darkening. "All right," he growled, leaning back in his chair and putting his dirty boots up on the table. "Let's have it. What the hell do you want with me and my horse?" The young man reached into his overcoat and pulled out a pair of polished steel handcuffs. He tossed them onto the green felt tabletop, where they landed with a loud clink. "Put 'em on," he said, his voice low and authoritative. The patrons all sensed that something was wrong, and the room suddenly went silent. Everyone turned to stare at the young stranger looming over the bearded man. After a second or two, Gus let out a guffaw. "You gotta be kidding me." The young stranger stood stock still, staring intently at the older man with his one good eye. There was no jest in his demeanor. "I said put 'em on," he repeated, his voice taking on a menacing tone. Gus stopped laughing when he heard the young man's voice. There was an intensity in it that told him the kid was serious. His jaw was clenched, and his expression grew dark. There was death in his gaze and ice-cold hate that froze the bearded man's heart. "You are under arrest," the young man declared. For the first time in a very long time, Gus McCoy felt a genuine shiver of fear crawl up his spine. There was a dangerous intensity about this young man, a feral quality that told him the stranger meant business. On what charge?" Gus managed to stammer after a moment. "Murder," the young man replied. "I'd say pure, simple murder. But what you did to those people was neither simple nor pure. Not by any stretch of the imagination." Gus's face went pale. He began to sweat profusely despite the cold, and he swallowed hard as he felt his throat go dry. His eyes darted around the room seeking an ally, but he found no support. Big Dole was still cleaning a shot glass, trying to make it look as though he were too busy to intervene. The other patrons were either too stunned to speak, too drunk to realize what was happening, or too afraid to make a move. The young man continued to stare at Gus unblinkingly. There was an unmistakably dangerous look in his one good eye. It was clear he would brook no nonsense, and he had a cold-blooded aura about him. "Kill him! Shoot him!" a voice screamed in the back of Gus's mind. His hand twitched reflexively, wanting to reach for the revolver that was holstered at his side. His instincts, however, told him it would be a bad idea. The stranger's own hand was already resting on the butt of his navy Colt. He cocked its hammer back, while still in the holster, and glared at him. "Go on, "Try it," he said quietly, as if reading the older man's mind. "I beg you." "He wants to kill me," Gus thought as he glanced at the long-barreled cap-and-ball revolver at the youth's side. "Listen, pal," Gus managed to gasp. "I don't know who you are or what your game is, but—" "I said put them on," the man growled. "Now!" Gus swallowed again and reached down, slowly picking up the handcuffs. His hands were shaking violently, and it took him a moment or two before he snapped the cuffs around his wrists. "Now what?" he said, holding up his manacles. "Now you're coming with me." The young man stepped forward and grabbed the older man roughly by the collar. He dragged him to his feet and began pulling him towards the door. "What's your name, kid?" the barkeep suddenly called after him. The young man stopped just short of the door and turned to face the barkeep, Gus still in his grip. "The name's Hogan," he said quietly. "Bart Hogan." "Bart Hogan, the judge?" Big Dole said, recognizing the name. "That's right," the young man replied. "I thought you were supposed to be older," said Big Dole, "and a whole lot fatter." "Sorry to disappoint you," the young man said dryly. "Legends seldom ever live up to reality." "Yeah," the barkeep said. "Guess you got a point there." The young man paused for a moment and looked around the saloon at the stunned faces of the patrons. "Now listen up, all of you, because I'm only going to say this once," the young man declared in a commanding voice. "Any man tries to stop me, tries to free this man, or otherwise attempts to interfere, I will gun him down without hesitation. Understood?" No one said a word or made a move. Some heads nodded in acknowledgement, but most of the patrons remained motionless. "Wait, where's your warrant?" Gus sputtered suddenly. "Don't I have a right to see some kind of paperwork first?" The young man ignored him. Instead, he looked at the barkeep and tossed a few gold sovereigns onto the counter. "Sorry for interrupting your evening," he said. "This one's on me." Without another word, he turned and pushed Gus out the door and into the snow. Gus's horse was still hitched to the post, and next to it was a dun blanket Appaloosa that belonged to the stranger. "What do you plan on doing with me?" Gus protested as he was pushed along. "I'm taking you back to New Corwick," he growled. "Your jail cell is waiting for you." "New Corwick?" cried Gus. "That's more than a 3-week ride from here." "That it is," agreed the young man. "Now get up on that horse before I kick you all the way there." The youth forced the older man up onto the bay, then untied the reins from the hitching post. He walked over to his Appaloosa, mounted up, and then led the bay forward, heading south. Gus glanced around, seeking any kind of support, but there was no one. Several people were standing in their doorways, watching silently as the scene unfolded. No one moved to help. The two men rode out of town. The only sound was the constant moan of the snow-laden wind and the wet crunching of hooves in the slush.